I'm Noortje Mares, a professor of science, technology, and society at the University of Warwick, and pleased to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the research project on public values in AI research, or PAIR, as we like to refer to ourselves. This is the last webinar in a series of three which have all focused in different ways on exploring cutting edge research that develops theories and methods for understanding values and the role of values in AI research. And I'm very pleased to today welcome two excellent speakers to the series, Shazeda Ahmed from UCLA and Atusa Kastirzadeh of Carnegie Mellon. Each of our speakers will talk for about 20 minutes, and we encourage all of you to pose questions. And I believe that this can be done as we go, so you can add your questions to the Q&A box. And initially, we will invite questions that are questions of clarifications or comments that are of immediate relevance to the presentation. And then after the two presentations and discussions of these, we will move on to a more open and wider collective conversation. And we are running for a full 90 minutes, so that really should also give us a good amount of time for conversation and discussion. So to start us off, I'm very pleased that Shazeda Ahmed will present her work. She is a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA and has investigated tech firms and their role in China in the creation and collaboration on social credit systems. She's also done work on emotion recognition and courtroom AI technologies in China. And she has been affiliated to many really relevant research institutes working in the broad area of AI and society. And her talk, if I'm right, has a title, Field Building and the Epistemic Culture of AI Safety. So over to you, Shazeda.
Thanks, Noortje. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Thank you so much. I've really been enjoying this webinar series, and I'm really excited, especially with the focus on research, to kind of use today as an opportunity to talk about methods and how we study these somewhat nebulous, slippery topics. So I do want this to be like Q&A. I'd love to hear about how people are grappling with some of the same methods and thinking about the mechanics of doing this research. And of course, I'd like to talk about the findings, but the arc will be, I'll present a little bit of the past work that Noortje just mentioned on field building and the epistemic culture of AI safety. And then I'll talk about some in-progress projects that I've built off of that, and a little bit of a preview of like work that is about to be done. And I want to talk about like the different methodologies and units of analysis across each of these. So to start with, there's a paper I and my colleagues at Princeton University came out with last year, Field Building and the Epistemic Culture of AI Safety. And, as early as 2022, as we saw the rise of ChatGPT, we also saw something happening in parallel, which was the term AI safety was being used more, but I hadn't yet seen someone cohesively define what is the field behind that, right? What are their beliefs and practices? So the two research questions that motivated this paper, right, were what are the practices and beliefs that internally define the field of AI safety? And then looking externally, we were interested in how are those ideas then translated into media and policy influence over global AI discourse and advocacy for AI governance. We also in this paper talk about how the kind of growing boundary around the groups of people who believe that they are working on AI safety we're largely drawing from kind of philosophical movements like effective altruism. So these are people who believe that they want to do the greatest amount of good in the world. They're kind of drawing from utilitarianism and think in terms of, how can we raise money for charities that we've measured have done things to save as many lives as possible or enable as many human beings as possible to exist in the future. And while a lot of their cause areas include things like pandemics and, so preventing pandemics and preventing nuclear war, animal welfare, there's a whole subset of that community that is genuinely worried about the possibility that we will get superhuman artificial intelligence, AGI, that they think will outperform humans at all economically valuable work as OpenAI would define AGI. And that there's this kind of binary belief around it of either we get utopia or dystopia, right? And in the dystopian imaginary, it's that we would end up with, super intelligent AI that would be bent on destroying humanity. And humanity is a word I'll come back to kind of later in this talk as something that's showing up a lot in the field work. So they've come to kind of spin off AI safety in part as a field to prevent, right, this worst case scenario. But along the way, um, the practices that we described that they developed were community building, forecasting, industry and academic research, and prize competitions. So the community building is, again, tapping on existing communities in effective altruism, and also long-termism. So people who are really focused on that. How do we preserve the existence of humans in the long-term future, thousands of years from now? And how do we prevent existential risk or risks that would lead to enough people dying off that we wouldn't be able to reproduce human beings? The online community building is like web forums of people who are interested in these topics, and then also are kind of circulating some of the research and some of their beliefs around AGI and how we might get there. There's also online kind of career coaching, so websites like 80,000 Hours. For the forecasting, these are basically practices where people are placing kind of like bets, but not quite like poly markets. They're not necessarily putting money on them, of when we might get AGI. And certainly there's other kind of sub bets, right? There's other terminologies like strong AI, transformative AI. People are essentially mapping out on a timeline what year they think we might get these things, and then making arguments for and against and providing evidence. And this is really more of a social practice than necessarily predicting something that is definitely going to happen. It's more of like the community building. For the industry and academic research, we were looking at like, well, what kinds of research topics qualify as AI safety? And while some of this is technical and largely focused on LLMs and how to get them to not be, say, as toxic or quote unquote deceptive or to hallucinate, there is a subset of this research that is also speculative, and kind of poses ideas for policymakers to prevent things like the creation of an AI bioweapon. And then finally, with the prize competitions, these are competitions where people are given a particular challenge or question and then submit their solutions. So that might be code, that might be a paper, it might be pseudocode and a mock-up idea of a solution to a problem. And a lot of this, it was a mix of like very bounded technical measurable kind of tasks versus the sort of more moral, philosophical, there's no right answer um, in the space. And I will say the combination of all of these factors has made this field pretty influential, even outside of people kind of within it who understand these terminologies and enjoy taking part in these social practices. And if you've seen a rise of media, kind of news media, talking about the possibility of AGI, if you've seen policymakers panic over X risk, it is largely because of the work coming out of this field, which is controversial work, right? There are computer scientists who have largely discredited it. I would say this is changing, and I can't wait for Atuza's talk to kind of hear about how it's changing. Like one of the things that was the case early in this work, and I know Atuza talks about this in her research, is that a lot of the research was not peer reviewed, right? It would be thrown up on Archive, ARXIV, which is kind of an online repository, usually for preprints. But in this space, things like blog posts end up on Archive, or like small experiments people do with LLMs. And of course, there's not really a culture of peer review and replicability studies on Archive. And yet, in this community, because that research would circulate in the web forums and maybe would be recommended to read as a precursor to joining one of the prize competitions, it would kind of end up continuing to have like a longer life in that space. So I want to move into some of the future work. And of course, anybody who hasn't read this paper, if you're studying the AI safety community, I think it's helpful. Um, but one of the things that my colleagues and I were kind of zooming in on and thinking about for a next project when we did this paper is that one of the research sub areas and part of what the promise of the AI utopia that a lot of people in this field believe we have a chance of achieving is this framing of the alignment problem as something that can be solved, right? So there's this baseline assumption among many people in this community that I've studied that the pursuit of AGI is achievable and will quote unquote benefit humanity, but that the biggest threat to that is misalignment with human values. Um, and so if anyone has read The Alignment Problem by Brian Christian, he tries to do a contemporary historicization of this problem. We can talk about the book. I think it sort of rewrites contemporary critical computing as fully focusing on alignment. So there are ways in which he subsumes questions of ethics and fairness. Researchers who would consider themselves to be doing more critical and interdisciplinary work that they think is in opposition to this framing of alignment are swept into his narrative as everybody is working on alignment. Um, there are a lot of different definitions of this kind of work, and there have been studies that look at like, well, what are all the different sub areas of alignment? So if you look in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, there's this kind of cluster representing different alignment papers, and this is even from a few years ago. So there's been an explosion since then. Um, what I've noticed in this field is that it's mostly technical research, right? Can you make an LLM do something? If you have a specific objective that you can formalize, can you make an LLM consistently produce outcomes that sort of fit that target? But what you see with the sort of popular framing of the alignment problem is there's this kind of overrepresentation of what people are calling value alignment. So going back to this idea of aligning an AI system with human values. Um, and value alignment ends up sort of speaking for the field, even though there's all these other kind of sub areas that I actually think, in a way, are more intellectually honest because they're not overpromising what you get when you achieve that particular type of alignment or that it is achievable. And so this is kind of where the interest with public values comes in here because ultimately people are saying that it is even possible, right, to elicit human values, to align AI systems with them, to pin them down as something that is static and measurable and consistent, and that would somehow lead to the prevention of mass catastrophe and to threats to human life. And so with the alignment problem research, we part of how we were starting this was also looking at like what are public narratives around alignment coming from tech companies. And we were starting to sort of see a corporate institutionalization of this field because ultimately, as a subfield, it doesn't challenge the political economy of AI, right? They're not saying let's look at things like public compute and public forms of governance and data sovereignty and working with, let's say, indigenous communities and thinking about what they want, right? A lot of this is how do we operate within the structures that already exist in this industry to attain alignment? Um, OpenAI had a super alignment team. So the idea was that they would, be building AGI and would need to align it, which is somehow much harder. They said they would dedicate 20% of their compute towards it. And that team lasted from July 2023 to May 2024. Um, the kind of tacit overarching question we were interested in, right? Anthropic has an alignment team. Certainly, alignment researchers are being hired across industry is can profit-seeking AI companies prioritize the conception of safety they've laid out without changing, right, this political economy of AI, without changing how they make and deliver the products that they do? And thus far, in this work, we're finding that it's intrinsically treated alignment as obviating the need for policy and structural kind of social interventions. I think this is coming at an interesting time in the US and certainly the EU, where we're seeing a deregulatory push from kind of right-leaning governments, right? In the US, there have been multiple proposals to place a ban on federal and potentially state regulations of artificial intelligence. And of course, in the EU, which I'm less familiar with, we are seeing kind of similar moves towards deregulation. And so we're kind of in an alignment boom right now. I thought for this group, especially, following where does alignment show up? Well, in the UK's AI Security Institute, recently renamed from Safety Institute, they've got an alignment fund with, I think it's a total pool of £15 million, and you can get these kind of research awards and grants to do alignment work for compute access. Venture capital, I've heard maybe not so much that's happening over there, but the fact that a government would promise that is kind of telling of like how this space wants to position itself as like being very industry friendly. Um, Expert support. So again, this feels like it is continuous with how we've studied the field of AI safety and how there's this culture of like placing really junior people in the field in contact with more senior mentors. Um, and so yeah, a lot of the academic research that we've been encountering in this space just assumes that alignment is possible, without pausing to question some of the core premises behind this narrative. And, we've gotten to the point where there's a little bit of even just like tongue-in-cheek satire about it. If people haven't checked out this Center for the Alignment of AI alignment centers, it's sort of making fun of how self-referential and self-reproducing this subfield is, how there's a ton of different centers that work on this. Um, these satirists are taking a needle to this whole kind of bubble. And some of, worth checking out, they say things like, we're working to subsume the countless other AI centers, institutes, labs, initiatives, and forums into one final AI center singularity. So making fun of the concept of the singularity that we would be indistinguishable from machines. And they say, fiercely independent, we are backed by philanthropic funding from some of the world's biggest AI companies who also form a majority on our board. This allows us to deliver policy solutions and legislation that can be implemented rapidly by lawmakers without the delay of democratic scrutiny, unless Trump has told them to stop regulating AI, in which case our work is totally pointless. I recommend, again, so this is sort of folding in the critique of like, this is a field that takes a lot of money from industry, and philanthropy is kind of in the EA space and doesn't actually put any political might behind it, right? If the political headwinds shift, then okay, maybe our work was not really worth very much versus like social collective pushback and responses that are more critical. And I recommend also trying, they have a fun three-part process to quote, start your own AI center in under 60 seconds, where you choose an organization type, at least two abstract concepts and a logo. And it's just very fun. I've kind of using it as an educational tool. I also want to point out, right, going back to this question of how are people in this field thinking about eliciting or capturing human values to then align AI systems with them. Um, there's this desire to use the kind of behavioral social sciences, right? So think of things like behavioral economics, or kind of different quantitative political science methods of studying people's preferences, and then being able to use that for this kind of ML research. So when you hear AI safety needs social scientists as like a call from two authors who now work at, I believe, Anthropic and the UK AC. Um, it's not saying we need sociology, anthropology, kind of more qualitative on the ground, thick description, right? This is very much about abstraction and what can we take off the shelf without necessarily learning about like the kind of history, context, appropriateness of using these methods, which I think is really important to follow when reading alignment research. And of course, in the social sciences, right, what sociological value is there to knowing what alignment work does and it doesn't do? I draw from anthropology and sociology for a lot of this work. So um, my first paper on this, the epistemic culture paper, it drew from the anthropologist Diana Forsyth, who was studying AI expert systems in the 1980s. And expert systems are really different from a lot of the LLMs we use today, which are based on reinforcement learning, because they were about again, capturing embodied knowledge from human beings. And in the case of many of the systems she looked at, they were going to be used in medical settings. So you had programmers and their research teams essentially interviewing, let's say, nurses and doctors and other medical practitioners, and then trying to use that expertise and codify it for systems that could do things like diagnosis. And so she would essentially shadow people in these labs and ask, what do they believe themselves to be doing when they do AI? What kind of a field do they believe AI to be? And this is very similar to what we're asking of alignment. Um, with the kind of question of how different fields become subsumed and appropriated in this work. I think specifically to the sociologist Alondra Nelson, who gave the keynote at the FACT conference, the Fair, Accountable, Transparent Machine Learning Conference 2 years ago. Her talk was about what she was calling thick alignment, right? So she is trying to directly reference Clifford Geertz' thick description, bringing back in the texture of everyday life and of people's, cultural, gender differences, socioeconomic differences into alignment work. And she alludes a little bit to this idea of AI agnotology. Agnotology is the study of how ignorance is cultivated around a subject, right? And while she didn't say this as explicitly, it's understood that there's strategic value to firms, tech firms, to ignore the documented problems of the systems they produce, right? ChatGPT's results can be inaccurate and dangerous. Products that third-party businesses build on top of these types of LLMs have caused real-world harm. We're all hopefully at this point familiar with the examples of AI psychosis and suicidality that have been circulating in the media a lot of late. Our studies are showing how this is a community of like an emerging expert class who has the ear of policymakers in the media and is also practicing a form of deliberate ignorance about how much they need to engage with social factors in computing. And so, as I said, some kind of in progress work. This piece with my colleagues from Princeton, who I did the epistemic culture study with, is an interview study, right? So, really turning to Forsyth, we cannot shadow people in these labs. They're very kind of secretive, and there's lots of NDAs. A lot has changed since her time. But we wanted to know, what do people believe themselves to be doing when they do alignment? What are the tasks that comprise this work? How do they mark progress? So we've done an interview study with alignment researchers around the world. They're all male, ages ranging from about 22 to 45. They're from the US, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia. And so these were people who we encountered their work in doing the first study and wanted to find the ones who self-identify as working on alignment and ask them, like, well, what do you actually do in a typical workday? Tell me about a specific project that your team took on and how you tackled it. What's the intended output of the work? How's your performance measured and evaluated? Are there gaps in research that you're concerned about? And normally I go into these three themes a little bit more, but so there are three kind of emerging themes from this work. The first is I talk about urgency as a self-renewing resource. So a lot of people will say, I didn't initially believe that we could get AGI, but then I saw how powerful ChatGPT was, and this really galvanized me to do something about it. Um, so, you know, their initial exposure can come from things like Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, or a talk that Toby Ord, who's one of the kind of main thinkers around long-termism and X-risk, had given. These are people who end up joining like boot camps and fellowship programs that we cite in the first paper as essentially taking people who are about university age and have maybe some computer science background, maybe none, and helping to upskill them within this new field, right? To learn its terminologies and its practices, to be paired with like an older mentor who's more influential in the field or has had more time in it to produce projects that are relevant to, let's say, alignment work, for example. Um, so there, prior to that, and certainly in parallel, there's also a kind of voluntarism. There are people who, um, have done this as kind of a hobby. I mentioned the forecasting. A lot of that is a kind of free labor, but also enjoyable for some people, a hobbyist sort of interest. Um, and they talked about finding expert talent and funding to be the biggest challenges. So kind of contrary to the satire of like the alignment of AI centers, some people look at this space and see it flush with funding for this kind of work, right? Like the 15 million pound UKAC pool. Um, but again, this self-renewing urgency, the idea that this problem is not getting solved and we need as many people on it as possible, like it's a story that continues to replicate itself that we're seeing in this space. The second thing was driving forward despite lack of consensus. So on that call, people really weren't defining AGI alignment, AI safety, but they were still really invested in going forward and doing this work. Um, and finally, institutionalization in service of legitimization. So as I talked about, a lot of the research hadn't been peer reviewed and had been kind of laughed at by different corners of academia. What's different from the Forsyth era to now is that people acknowledge field building as the work, that they acknowledge the time spent helping young people, helping volunteers, bringing them into the fold as the work. Um, I know I'm kind of short on time, so I want to skip ahead a little bit to talk about this second paper and then wrap up. So sorry for like the abrupt shift, but I'm also interested, in addition to this kind of interview work, where we hear from people themselves about what it is that when they do alignment research on what can we learn from reading value alignment papers. And so I'm working on this paper with like our anchor author, Baby Burhani, with Andrew Smart and Jackie Kay. And so it's a mix of people in industry and academia who have done pretty critical research in this field. And so we're interested in what is the operative concept of values in alignment? How does the emergent theory of value in this field compare with decades of anthropological and social science research on the diversity of human values? Um, and so what they've all done, this was research they designed that I have joined, I'm happy to, is they've used their own kind of methodology to determine what are like the most cited 100 kind of AI value alignment papers. And we read them and have a coding schema to understand, right? Do they define value? Like, are they subscribing to value monism or pluralism, right? Do they believe that there's multiple dimensions to value? Do they believe they're measurable or not? And we're essentially trying to understand across these papers, like methodologically as well, how are they using synthetic data? Are they using prompted LLMs? Are they like how methodologically are we supposed to attain this goal of aligned AI, and what kinds of values, right, end up shaping that work? Where do they come from? So some early kind of impressions of this work is they actually typically don't define value. They align it with human intentions, human preferences. They're very abstract. They don't deal with which humans they mean when they talk about values. Um, while 10% of the papers, especially the experimental papers, will use human annotators to evaluate model inputs and outputs, the field is increasingly turning to synthetic data and auto raters for evaluation. So that's sort of where our working title of Alignment Without Humans comes from, is the idea that humans themselves are biased, and somehow we can attain like a kind of pure ideal in using synthetic data that will be like more kind of consistent than human data annotators. So I'm happy to answer questions about either of those papers. I want to wrap up here. And the next kind of concept I've been turning to for the future work I'm doing, going back to this phrase of benefit to humanity, we see this echoed over and over, and I don't think we see it challenged enough, right? Like very recently, Microsoft said that they have a new team that will focus on creating AI designed only to serve humanity. Like, what were we doing before? And when humanity gets evoked in this way, right, the question is like, which humans, right? This word is almost always like a faceless, placeless, rootless humanity. There's quite a bit of literature in anthropology that talks about essentially how there is no universalizing conception of who counts as human or humanity. Even reading back to Fanon, right, there's work that challenges the idea that humanity or human is a word that gives people rights. It's often sometimes masking whose rights are taken away. And so I've been interested in this question of who defines benefit, especially since we've seen the rise of companies filing as AI public benefit corporations. So these are companies, they don't get like a tax write-off, they don't get any special loopholes, but they do get to state that they have a mission to serve the public and that they will hold themselves accountable to doing, and they can override decisions that their shareholders want them to make to maximize profit if they can say that they took an action in service of the mission. Anthropic is a PPC. OpenAI is about to become one famously. And again, they have these really nebulous goals of ensuring that AGI serves humanity. And so I'm interested, especially given the context of this seminar, who is the public? What are their values? How do these companies potentially purpose wash when they come up with these mission statements? And my colleagues and I are looking at several dozen of these companies for interviews in the next year. Anyway, thank you so much, Jack and Kian, for organizing. Thank you, Nurcha, for moderating. And I'm really excited to hear from Atusa and everyone else.
Yeah, thank you, Shazeda. That was really super interesting. Um, I have lots of questions, and even better, there's also already a question from participants from Andy Sterling. Andy, would you like to just pose your question?
Oh, thanks, Nurture. Yeah, thanks for a great talk. This isn't a question aimed specifically at the talk, which I'm learning a lot from, but I just wondered that given that arguably under any view, the most important fact in politics in general and in any vision of democracy is that understandings and values and interests do not align, how can even the idea of alignment be entertained, let alone defended and institutionalized? Is it not one of those things that's so starkly, manifestly flawed that it's actually self-refuting? So in that sense, then doesn't it, even a critical discourse that engages with that idea, isn't it inadvertently becoming a kind of regulatory capture? So I guess this is an obvious point. I'm a bit ignorant in the field. So I guess there's been discussions of the dangers of even engaging critically in a way that doesn't just completely reject the idea, is kind of contributing to the same problem. But yeah, I'd just be interested in anything around that that might be explained.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're saying that because this was kind of well, exactly what you're saying is the hunch that made me think studying alignment is really important because you're right. There are a lot of people who don't question this narrative and just assume like this is the best path forward. This is the only way to make these systems good or benefit humanity. But part of why methodologically I read the literature and talk to the researchers when possible is because I'm not seeing very many references to democracy. I'm not seeing them talk about like how will this operate within existing political systems. Something that's really interesting is like a lot of alignment research will conduct experiments, say like our method beats these other methods, our systems are more aligned in this particular definition of alignment than any prior work, but they're not being taken up, right? Like we have hundreds of little experiments that tech companies aren't using, right? That the systems we use every day are not implementing. And even if they did, right, as you say, there are going to be values that are in tension with other values. That's part of why in this work we look at is their conception of value stable or dynamic, right? Are they thinking a value like you mentioned democracy, which almost none of these papers do. It's like a snapshot you can take in the data set, and then we can just continue to implement it and it won't change over time. We know that's not how human beings work, right? And so that is part of like what's motivating this work is we want to give people who don't follow the research as closely, but hear the public narrative of how it's going to get us to AGI utopia, more tools and more understanding of like, well, what is really happening in this research? Where are these millions of dollars and hours going? If not to a kind of speculative exercise that formalizes things that perhaps are not achievable.
Yeah. So arguably, thanks, Shazeda. I mean, arguably, then the critical literature on this point is even more toxic to various ideas of democracy than the actual initiatives around alignment themselves, because of what it purports and implies itself to be.
There's still emerging critical literature, right? Like that's part of what I'm trying to contribute to is just pointing out like nobody's put a label on this of disclaimer of like you're not really actually going to get these kinds of outcomes even if we did implement some of these
Mhm.
solutions. But when everybody's going guns blazing forward on like alignment is the thing that is going to save us, I
Yeah.
really want non-experts to be able to understand why that's not true.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was interested to ask a question of clarification myself relating to the concept of safety, because I was very struck by A, how quickly you got from safety to AGI,
Yeah.
that it was possible to make that transition so seamlessly. But also your remarks about the quite studied tactical ignorance of harms. So could you say a little bit more about definitions of safety and or safety actually remaining quite underdefined?
Yeah. So in the epistemic culture paper, we looked at early papers in the field by influential researchers who were mapping out like what should this field focus on. And I think the four areas that came out of one of these papers were monitoring, like robustness, alignment. I forget the other one. It might have been tail risk. So like the long tail of things that have a low probability of happening, but if they did happen, they would have like disastrous effects. And that's already showing us that that definition of safety doesn't really include social harm. Or actually, no, systemic risk was the fourth area. And it was like the everything else, right? The idea that these things can somewhat be done equally and that systemic risk, which is like cybersecurity, privacy, ethics, right? The mental health harms that we know these systems have on people every single day. They're sort of like the conception of safety in this field is enough people are working on those issues already, but these other issues are marginalized and have such potential to be completely disastrous that they deserve more attention. And again, it's going back to like these premises of assuming that we're going to get sentient AGI, like what would we want to prevent on the way? Deception, right? The like what's so interesting is a lot of this work will make the leap of the system was able to do this thing particularly consistently, right? This LLM produced this result consistently. It must mean that it understands. And I think there's just so much missing work here or in that field or opportunities to engage on like, well, what is cognition? What is consciousness, right? What do you mean it understands? And I think we have an impoverishment of language around this, like all the anthropomorphizing language only serves to further um, kind of funnel the work in this direction that assumes these things are possible and are the most important things to work on rather than the slow work that kind of critique helps us do. So that's kind of what safety is focused on there, right? People will outright say we don't care if it's producing, hate speech or making young people, prone to self-harm. There's other people working on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's something maybe we can return to later also in terms of the, risk-based versus harm-based conceptions of safety and how in other areas of techno-scientific controversy we've seen, those two very different conceptions of safety being mobilized by different kinds of communities.
Yeah.
But I also see that there's a second question from Brigitte Nernick. Would you be able to pose your question?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to get to read all of this as closely as I'd want to for a question, but I understand what you're asking me. The difference between when you say tech speak, I guess what I'm wondering is like industry and industry
Yeah.
research or right. So like and value. So when could you say
I
what you
mean,
mean?
it's just for short for social science speak in a way. I mean, yeah.
Mm.
Whereas there's a misalignment between the sort of technical language and the social science language in terms of alignment.
Kind of, but what I will say too is in our sample of 100 papers, like when we encounter papers that are saying like, let's use the principal agent problem or like framings from behavioral economics, they're trying to make the kind of knowledge they produce commensurate with this field and saying like it will serve this field. So I think there's this interesting dynamic of like we're signing up to be intelligible to you and to be in service of you rather than pointing out like where there's rupture between how our field has produced knowledge around these things historically and how you, this new field, do that. So I'm not seeing as much of a rupture there as I would expect.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, yeah. No, it was just puzzling me sometimes.
Me too. Yeah, for sure.